Do you guys ever have any reason to talk about that?
Well, yes. So I think it would have been Justice Blackmun's, it might have been his 80th birthday, but it was one of his big birthdays. We were having a clerks reunion, and as you know, in Flood against Kuhn, which is the baseball antitrust case, there's this kind of passage at the beginning of it that's a list of famous baseball players, and it goes on and on. And apparently he started out with about 10 of them. Then various people around the building would suggest people, and then somebody said, well, but if you're going to include, if you're going to include Tinkers, you have to include Evers. Oh, if you're going to include Evers, you have to include Chance. And so that list kind of expanded and expanded. And there was a story in the Brethren that right after the opinion came down, somebody said to him, how could you not include Jimmie Foxx? And he said, Jimmie Foxx was on the list. And the person said, no, he's not. And the justice went back and looked at the list, and sure enough, Jimmie Foxx is not on the list. And the line in the Brethren is something like, and Justice Blackmun said, I'll never forgive myself. So for his 80th birthday, I think it was his 80th, we decided we were going to get him one of Jimmie Foxx's bats. And we looked into it, and we could not find one. But it turns out that Hillrich and Bradley, I think that's what the Louisville Slugger Company's name is, they keep the measurements of every player on file for their bats. And so we went to them, and we had them replicate one of Jimmie Foxx's bats, and we had it mounted on a plaque, and on the bottom it just said, I will never forgive myself, H-A-B. And we gave it to him, the clerks all gave it to him for his birthday, and I saw it actually posted in his chambers the day he died. After his funeral, we all went back to the chambers to hang out, and there was the bat, which I think was, several people asked for it, but I think it was given to the Library of Congress. And the other thing about baseball is he had been a friend of the Griffiths, who owned then the Minneapolis Millers, later the Twins, and so we would talk about baseball a lot at breakfast, and one day in the afternoon, I was in the upstairs chambers, and I got a phone call, you should come down. The justice has somebody he wants you to meet. And this group called the Emil Verbin Society was having its reunion in Washington. I guess it's a Cubs thing. And so there were these 3 guys in like bad-fitting sports coats in his office, and he introduced them to me, and 2 of them I don't remember the names because I'm not a Cubs fan at all, but the last one was Andy Pafko, who had been a Dodger as well. And so I had a nice conversation one afternoon with Andy Pafko. And the last baseball thing I'll tell you is when Justice Blackmun retired from the Supreme Court, I was asked to do one of the tributes for him in the Harvard Law Review. And one of the things I talked about in the tribute was this article that had been written called Your Law Baseball Quiz. I think I told you about this last night, where they compare different justices to different famous baseball players. And I said that, and so I tell the story of, Jackie Jensen is like Byron White because they were both better at football. And then I say, the guy who did this compared Felix Frankfurter to, among other things, Wayne Terwilliger. And in the article I just had a footnote, I said, who is Wayne Terwilliger? And so, and then ultimately I said that if I had to pick somebody for Justice Blackmun to be like, I had thought originally about Bobby Brown, because Justice Blackmun wanted to be a doctor, just like Bobby Brown became a doctor, and that I thought of, a couple of other people like that, Charlie Gehringer, because he was a little tiny, little tiny second baseman, and, a great fielder, but not a big batter. And ultimately I came out with Dave Winfield, which people might not have guessed, because both of them came from St. Paul and made something of themselves. Both of them played the game long after many of their contemporaries had retired, and both of them owed their start to a convicted but later pardoned Watergate felon. To a later pardoned Watergate felon, because Blackmun got his seat on the Supreme Court from Nixon, and George Steinbrenner is the person who gave Dave Winfield his biggest contract. And so when so I read this, and I went and and the next time I visited the justice said, "Oh, I really liked your tribute a lot, but come with me." And he led me down the hall into the storeroom. He was then down at the Thurgood Marshall Center, and he pulled out a copy of the Baseball Encyclopedia, And he said, "This is Wayne Terwilliger," and took me to the page for Wayne Terwilliger. So.
Twig, he was known as.
I'd never heard of him, and I'm a baseball fan, and I'd never heard of him.
Should baseball retain its antitrust exemption?
Well, I'm a big Bill James fan, and Bill James has a discussion of this where he says that if you got rid of the antitrust exemption, what you might start to see is a kind of proliferation of a third or fourth major league almost coming out of minor league teams. I'm not sure what function the antitrust exemption really performs today, given that there's now an agreement between the Players Association and the teams, right? And a huge percentage, ever since free agency, a huge percentage of the revenue has moved over to the players. I'm not sure that the existing players would favor getting rid of the antitrust exemption.
Such an anachronism.
Yeah, but hard to see that it's actually having much effect on the game itself. And the real question is how you maintain competitive balance, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to maintain the sport, the real question is how to maintain competitive balance. And without the antitrust exemption, it might be harder. Right?
Did you ever talk about Roe versus Wade, you guys?
Yeah. So the first time he talked about Roe versus Wade is when I went to interview with him. Justice Blackmun had been a tax lawyer before he was then counsel at the Mayo Clinic, and he had exactly the habits you would expect from somebody who had been a very good tax lawyer. He was like incredibly meticulous and precise. And so when he interviewed people, he had this long list of questions written out, and he asked you the questions, then he wrote down the answers in pencil. And towards the end of the interview, he said, "Now, I want to ask you a question, and I want you to think about this very carefully." So I was there, and then he said, "Now, I've written an opinion that's a little bit controversial, and some people find it the kind of opinion that they have trouble with, and you need to think about whether you would be comfortable working for me given the opinion." And I'm sort of racking my brain to think, like, what opinion is he talking about? And he said, "You may have heard of it." And now I'm thinking, okay, what is he going to say? He said, "It's called Roe against Wade." And I'm a little bit of a kind of smartass sometimes, and all I could think is, just don't say, "Oh my God, you're that Harry Blackmun? You're kidding." But he actually had a clerk apparently several years before who had, in the middle of the year, had a religious revelation that Roe was wrong, and it had made for an awkward year. So that was the first time that I had a conversation with him. We had 2 abortion cases my year at the Supreme Court, and it was actually the kind of high watermark of abortion rights at the Supreme Court was one of those cases, a case called Thornburg against American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, which the justice wrote. And so we had a fair number of conversations about abortion, and he was convinced that, that was also the first time that it was 5-4 to uphold the kind of central premise of Roe, because the Chief Justice switched sides. So we talked about a lot then, and then as you probably know, he used to teach at the Aspen Institute in the summer, a Justice and Society class, and he spent a day of that talking about the decision process leading up to Roe, and I was there one year, and he talked about that there.
What did he say?
Well, it's interesting. I think, although he wouldn't put it quite this way, his thoughts about Roe evolved somewhat over time. Because when he started on the case, his major the major focus for him was the practice of medicine, because he had come out of being counsel at the Mayo Clinic, and he took very seriously the idea that this was a medical procedure, and therefore it was up to women in consultation with their doctors to make this decision in the way that would be true of all other medical procedures. I think over time he came to see Roe as equally about women's autonomy, that it wasn't mostly about medical autonomy, it was about women's autonomy. And by the time I got there, I think he was thinking about it in those two things were much more in equipoise in being important to him. But he just thought it was not the kind of decision that should be made categorically by the state as opposed to by individuals given the circumstances they found themselves in.
Had Jane Rose publicly switched positions by then?
No. I think she had said by then that she regretted having had the abortion, but it wasn't until maybe about 5 years ago or so that she filed a sort of coram nobis trying to get Roe overturned.